Should John Hlophe be disqualified from sitting as an MP on the body which interviews and recommends judges for their appointment? In this episode, we'll explore all this and more. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, where we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. I'm Mpofu-Walsh. Good to have you on board again. Now, the big question, and not a day goes by in South African politics when there isn't a big question right now, is should Dr. John Hlophe be able to sit on the Judicial Service Commission as a designated MP? And in this episode, I am going to give you a deep dive into some of the legal questions and the political ramifications of this debate. I want to start by looking at the background. Who is Dr. Hlophe? What is the JSC? And what is the debate around whether he should be able to sit there as an MP? Then I want to dive deep into the legal questions. And finally, we'll look at some of the implications and political ramifications. So let's get started. Who's Dr. John Hlophe? A very interesting and fascinating person. He was Judge President of the Western Cape Division of the High Court. He has a PhD in law from Cambridge and has been a judge, or was a judge, for 23 years before he was impeached as a judge for gross misconduct. What does that mean in simple language? It means he did things which were bad enough to remove him from the office of being a judge. What was the gross misconduct? Well, according to the Judicial Conduct Tribunal and later Parliament, which voted 2/3 for him to be impeached, he improperly attempted to influence justices of the Constitutional Court to find in favor of Jacob Zuma in a case relating to his corruption trial. Now, it's even more interesting than that, because not only was he impeached, which is very rare, but he came back as a member of parliament after he was impeached for the MK party. And he now serves as their parliamentary leader, and indeed as leader of the opposition in South Africa now that the DA has gone into government, because MK is the next largest opposition party. So we have this interesting scenario in which there is someone who used to be a judge, who is impeached from that office for gross misconduct, but who has come back to Parliament as an MP, and who has now been designated by Parliament to serve on the commission, or the place which interviews judges and recommends their appointment. So the question is that legally permissible? And then there are also questions about whether it's ethically appropriate. Largely, I'm going to try and draw out a position where I think it is legally permissible, although I think there are also ethical considerations. And so we need to separate the ethics from the law on this question. But let me explain. Here's the argument, the legal argument, because I believe that Freedom Under Law and probably other NGOs are preparing an application to declare this legally invalid, quite apart from the ethical questions. Here's their argument, and let's give it its due respect. Hlophe was a judge and he was impeached. Being impeached for serious misconduct is obviously lamentable and bad. The JSC is a body which tries to find the best possible judges in the country who are unimpeachable, and therefore a person who themselves has been impeached from the JS, or from being the office of a judge, should not be able to sit in judgment, or at least in selection of those key officers if they themselves have fallen foul of the criteria for being a judge. In other words, you can't sit on the same body which has found you to have transgressed the rules of conduct, which you are now then sitting in judgment on for others. That's the argument. Now, there are some problems with this argument, at least from a legal perspective, in my view, when we place it under the microscope. And I want to start by looking at whether there are any explicit legal prohibitions against someone like John Hlophe, who is an impeached judge from sitting on the JSC. And I don't believe there are any express or explicit legal prohibitions against that. So the first way to look at this is to make sure that we compare Section 177 of the Constitution and Section 89 of the Constitution. Now, these are two interesting sections because one deals with the impeachment of a judge and the other deals with the impeachment of the president. Now, have a look at this. In many ways, they're the same, but there's a key difference in these provisions. So if we look at Section 177, which is the removal of the judge provision, it says a judge may be removed from office only if, which is Section 177.1, and then 177.1a, only if the Judicial Service Commission, the JSC, finds that the judge suffers from an incapacity, is grossly incompetent, or is guilty of gross misconduct. Whereas if we compare the similar provision in Section 89, it says under removal of the president, the National Assembly, by resolution adopted with a supporting vote of at least 2/3 of its members, may remove the president from office only on the grounds of, and one of those grounds is a serious violation of the Constitution or the law, or B, serious misconduct, and the other one is an inability to perform the office. So we have roughly similar provisions there, right? Which is that either a judge or the president must be removed by a vote in parliament if they've committed some kind of serious impropriety. However, Section 177 effectively stops there. It doesn't give any further consequences for the removal of a judge from office. Whereas if we look at Section 89.2, get this, it says this: anyone who has been removed from the office of president in terms of subsection 1A or B, so the earlier subsections, may not receive any benefit of that office, but here's the real kicker, and may not serve in any public office. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. So if you are impeached as the president, you may not serve in any public office thereafter. However, if you are impeached as a judge, the Constitution is silent on whether you can remain in any other public office, which suggests that if the Constitution really had the purpose of precluding those who had been impeached from judicial office from serving in other public office, it would have said so in the exact same way as it explicitly says so in Section 89 when you're impeached as president. So either the Constitution is inconsistent in the sense that it's explicit sometimes and it's not explicit when it could be other times, or the consequences of impeachment from judicial office are different from the consequences of impeachment from presidential office. In other words, if you're impeached as a judge, that doesn't mean you can't be an MP, doesn't mean you can't hold any other public office, obviously except judicial office, at least in terms of explicit constitutional provisions. Now, interestingly, again, when we look at the JSC Act, which is the legislation which brings the JSC into being, there is also no explicit fit and proper criterion for people who are members of the JSC. Funnily enough, yes, there's a fit and proper criterion to be a judge and various other officers within the criminal justice system or the judicial system. But there is no explicit test for who gets to sit on the JSC as an MP. Other than that, the Constitution gives Parliament the power to designate MPs. So the hard and cold fact of the matter is that there is no explicit legal provision which prevents Dr. John Hlophe from sitting on the JSC. One may not like it, one may think it's unethical, one may think it's improper, one may think it's undesirable, but it is not legally invalid in terms of explicit provisions of the Constitution or statute. Now, what those who are seeking the legal review of Dr. Hlophe's presence on the JSC may argue is that, okay, there is no explicit legal provision, but there are implicit provisions, or we can imply from certain provisions in the Constitution that this is not allowed. So what I think they will try to suggest is that when we read the Constitution as a whole, there is a certain irrationality of allowing for this situation. But even then, I think there are some questions which need to be asked legally of that approach. Now, the first, as I say, is of course the Constitution being very explicit in terms of the president. So there's going to have to be some kind of argument about why it's silent in one case and very loud in another case. But the rationality argument is also based on the following argument, that it is irrational for the same body which has excluded someone to be a judge to also allow that person to select judges. That's the nub of it. There's a certain irrationality there. But I think that elides or papers over a number of differences in this case, because Hlophe is not seeking to be a judge. He is an MP acting in his capacity as an MP through the Constitution, selecting judges. And so there is something of an equivalence being drawn here between the requirements to be a judge and the requirements to be an MP who sits in selection or in interviewing and recommending the office of a judge, or being part of a panel. And being a judge is not the same as being part of a panel which interviews and recommends judges as an MP. And that's why, although it may be irrational for him to be a judge again, it might not be irrational for him to serve on that committee as a politician. Now, there's another further complexity to this, to the extent that if it is irrational for him to sit on a body which has found against him, then how come he can sit in Parliament, which actually is the body that impeached him by 2/3 vote? So if he's not competent to sit on the JSC, is he also likewise not competent to be an MP? Because he would be in the same body which found him incapable of being a judge. Again, the same logic applies. He can be an MP because there he is not fulfilling the functions of a judge. And of course, the bar to being a judge is higher in many ways than the bar to being a politician or an MP. There are certain qualification criteria, but there are also certain requirements of impartiality that are required of judges that aren't required of members of parliament. So merely having been found to have transgressed a rule by one body does not mean you cannot subsequently play a role in that same body, given that it's a different role and it's a different capacity. And so I'm not sure that the irrationality is as clear-cut as those who use the same body argument present it to be. But there is a deeper question about rationality, because rationality, as far as legality is concerned, has to do with the means that are used to achieve some kind of constitutional end or some kind of legal end. Is there a rational connection between the means and the end? And here we need to ask what the means are and what the end is. And here's what I think the true end of having an MP serving on the JSC is. The end is democratic representation in the selection of judges. Otherwise, we would simply select judges. We would use AI to select judges, or we would simply have some kind of mechanical qualification criteria, or we would just get a whole bunch of unelected lawyers in a room to decide who the best lawyer is. But the fact of the matter is, judges exercise a certain form of public power. And so in order to grant them the legitimacy to exercise that power, there has to be a certain amount of democratic control over the selection of those judges. So MPs are on the JSC, among other things, to lend democratic legitimacy to the ultimate interview and selection, so that there is a connection between the voice of the people and the voice of different constituencies in the country, and the ultimate appointment, or at least interview and recommendation, of a judge. And it doesn't seem to be irrational for the leader of the opposition, as a politician who represents an important constituency, to have their voice heard on the JSC. So the rationality of this needs to be looked at through the prism of why MPs are on the JSC, and not simply what the JSC does or whether Hlophe was a judge or not. So I think there is that question about there being a very clear rational connection between why MK is allowed to send a judge, or rather send a member and be designated, versus the other side of the coin. So I'm not convinced that there's a rationality argument here, because this is ultimately a question of the democratic rights of MPs. Remember, as an MP, you actually get given huge powers. There are maybe no more important offices in South Africa than that of MPs, right? You can only become the president through parliament, and only MPs can choose the president. There are certain things that only MPs can do, and the whole reason we have an election is precisely to elect these MPs into office. So MPs have power, and they have rights to exercise that power by virtue of the democratic legitimacy that they have. And what we must avoid is a situation in which there are some MPs who are more equal than others. So there are MPs who are elected into office through a legitimate process, and yet their rights to exercise and to hold that office are constrained versus their counterparts. Every MP should have similar rights to hold office, whether they come from one party or another, because that is what people gave them the power to do. So I think there is an argument about the power that MPs are able to wield through the democratic process in different parliamentary committees and different parliamentary designations that must also be respected. And effectively, even if you don't like MK, and I'm no big fan of MK, I have big problems with some of their policy positions and some of their statements in the past. That doesn't mean that I get to say, just because I don't like an MK politician, they aren't able to hold the office with all its privileges and duties and powers. So, there is a case, the Simelane case, which actually deals with a similar question, which is about the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Menzi Simelane, and whether it was rational. And the Concourt actually found that it was not rational to appoint him to this office. So let's have a look at this. Simelane was found to have not been sufficiently conscientious, sufficiently honest, and fit and proper to serve in the role of National Director of Public Prosecutions. This is the person who runs the NPA. And it was on the basis of a finding of a commission. And the DA went to the Concourt and said the president should not have appointed this person because this commission had already cast aspersions over their integrity. And the court agreed. So freedom under law may say, or those who think there is a legal route here may say, well, look at Simelane. The appointment of someone can be reviewed on rational grounds. There were findings against Simelane. There were adverse findings against Hlophe. And it was found that it was irrational, and it likewise should be found that Hlophe's designation should be irrational. But this would overlook serious differences between these cases. The first difference, obviously, is that there is only one head of the National Prosecuting Authority. So they were appointing a specific leader. Hlophe is not vying to be the Chief Justice, which would be the direct analogy. He is simply a member of a selection panel which selects not just one position, but all judges. So there's quite a significant difference there. The other difference is that the NPA Act has specific criteria for who can be the National Director of Public Prosecutions. Like I just said, the JSC Act does not have those criteria for who can be a member of the JSC. So it's clear that there is not a direct analogy between a president, and by the way, there's no president involved here, it's Parliament designating. There's a clear difference between a president appointing an NDPP and the test for rationality there, and Parliament designating an MP through a constitutional power to a selection panel. So I'm not so convinced that you can just throw around Simelane and assume that there's a connection between that case and this case. So having said that, there's one final argument that I find persuasive, and it's this. We live in a constitutional dispensation where it has been found that double punishment or gratuitous punishment or indefinite forms of punishment, even though they may be appropriate in certain exceptional circumstances, do not apply across the board. So once you have been punished, you then move onto the road to rehabilitation, and you aren't constantly punished over and above the punishment that it was appropriate that you received. In this case, Dr. John Hlophe has been punished. He has been impeached. It's embarrassing, it brings shame, it brings public condemnation, and it tarnishes you when you get impeached by Parliament. And he has suffered that punishment. But that doesn't mean that he should now suffer new forms of punishment simply because he has already been punished before. Let's take John Hlophe out of this equation and look at some other examples that might bring the point home. Gayton McKenzie. He was convicted of and sentenced for serious crimes, right? I think it was involving bank robbery. He served his time, he served his punishment, and through a process of rehabilitation has come back as an MP. Should he now no longer serve as a minister, or should he not be able to fulfill his functions on parliamentary committees because he did really bad, opprobrious things in the past? No, he's been punished and he served the punishment, and now he no longer has to endure the punishment beyond what was already given to him. Likewise, why should Dr. John Hlophe, as terrible or however bad you think the influencing of judges may have been, after that punishment has been served, why should there be an additional punishment on a new office when he has in fact already taken an oath to uphold the Constitution in the intervening period? People like Zizi Kodwa are in Parliament. He's facing a corruption case, right? Now, ethically, and we'll get to this later, I don't think he should be there. I don't think someone like Ronaldo Gous should ethically be in Parliament after the things he has been found to have said. But it's very difficult legally to say that there is some kind of constitutionally inferred prohibition from them executing their power as MPs. So I think there's a certain vindictive element which cuts against the spirit of the Constitution to want to infinitely punish someone who has already served the punishment for their crime, as it were. Having said that, in addition to all of that, there are various other constitutional safeguards which would defend the integrity and the dignity of the JSC and thereby the judiciary, even if Dr. Hlophe rightfully sits on his JSC seat. The first internal safeguard is just in the interviews, the chairperson can, rule against any kind of unethical line of questioning. So that's the first thing. It's not as if Dr. Hlophe can ask whatever he wants. If there's some danger that he's going to ask an unethical question, then the chairperson can intervene, and that happens regularly in the JSC. There are voters who can punish the MK party, who can say, we think this is unethical conduct that doesn't resonate with us as voters. We'll vote against you in the next election. And we should confine these kinds of questions to the political ground rather than trying to legalize them. There is public condemnation. There is public media accountability. Believe me, if Hlophe asks any question, Judges Matter will be running to the ENCA studios that very minute, right? So there are forms and mechanisms of accountability inbuilt in our constitutional system. Hlophe has to take an oath to be an MP, which he has taken subsequent to his impeachment. So he has sworn to uphold the Constitution. And if he fails to uphold that oath, then there are accountability mechanisms that can come in at that stage too. So I just think that the hysteria around his presence on the JSC is a little overblown, because I don't see this immediate danger that presents itself by him merely taking up one of 23 seats. And I'll say this in terms of the connection with rationality too. What is the real material consequence of this? It's one member out of 23 members who doesn't have a decisive say, who is in an extreme minority, and whose voice, even if it is a very strong voice, is only one vote out of 23. I don't see how that threatens to undermine the integrity or the dignity of the judiciary as a whole, let alone the credibility of the JSC, which draws its credibility from multiple different sources and which remains intact, whether Dr. Hlophe is there or not, quite frankly. So, having said that, I want to have a look at some of the political questions in conclusion that we need to bear in mind here. One interesting thing for me is that this already shows cracks in the GNU's capacity to unite in Parliament. The DA voted one way, not to designate Hlophe. The ANC voted another way, so there was already a break between the two biggest parties in the GNU. And that is quite shocking to me, because I really thought that this whole GNU arrangement was premised on the idea that the parties would agree in Parliament on virtually everything. But if they're already breaking at the first sign of controversy, then it shows that they're not as united as the idea of a GNU would suggest. The other thing is that I think both the DA and the MK will benefit politically from this, because it speaks to their constituencies in different ways. For the DA, they benefit because they get to appear as if they're taking the moral high ground. They get to criticize Dr. Hlophe. Their constituency doesn't like him, and they get to appear as if they stand on the side of the rule of law. And that will play well to their constituency. However, MK also benefits politically from this, because Hlophe is presented as some kind of martyr against whom there is a vindictive agenda that goes beyond the rule of law. There is an attempt to undermine the credibility of black judges, etc. That's the kind of narrative that MK will be able to exploit in the scenario. And we saw them exploiting that exact same narrative when Zuma himself was disqualified from Parliament, which ended up being an exceptionally useful political moment for MK, which united the party and sent them over the top in the election. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch, and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. For the ANC, I think once again it just shows the indecisiveness of this ANC, because after they voted to support Hlophe's designation, they then appeared to backtrack and released a statement saying that although they voted one way, it's not to suggest that they've made up their minds fully. They just need to seek clarity on, whether the silence in the Constitution is actually decisive or not. So we have an ANC that is again trying to balance on two planks instead of just taking a decisive position. And I think that is indicative of the ANC we saw before the election. And it may suggest that this is the same ANC we're going to see after the election, trying to split hairs and dance on the head of a pin when really clear decisions are required. I hope that's given you some view on what this Hlophe JSC question means. I will say this. If it was me, I would take a different ethical decision. I probably wouldn't serve on the JSC. In this video, I've tried to look at the legal questions because it's being taken to court. But I will also say that even if there are ethical concerns about sitting on a selection panel where you do not meet the criteria for that selection, a lot of people on the JSC don't meet the criteria to be a judge. A lot of people on the JSC don't have an LLB. That doesn't mean their voice is not appropriate to be on the JSC. So just because you're not the best person to be a judge does not mean that you're disqualified from the JSC. But even if there are ethical concerns, I still don't think it's wise to try and legislate around every possible ethical concern. Because the unintended consequences of that would be that then Zizi Kodwa will not be able to exercise his role in Parliament because there's an ethical concern. Gwede Mantashe, there's a commission finding against him. He wouldn't be able to exercise his powers as a cabinet minister. If you think that you should not be able to exercise your role as a member of Parliament because there are ethical concerns around your conduct, I'm afraid I have news for you, South Africa. We will not have any MPs being able to exercise any role because many members of our Parliament are seriously ethically compromised and challenged. In fact, some say that just to be a politician requires ethical compromise. To legislate against every possible ethical compromise is to try and do the legally impossible. And ethical questions should be dealt with in the political arena where the voters decide what the appropriate ethical threshold is. Trying to litigate it through the courts is a recipe for unintended consequential disaster. And so if we prevent MPs from exercising their rights due to ethical considerations, then we may as well at this point not have any MPs. That's the sad reality of South African politics, but we're not alone in unethical political conduct. The only question is, to what extent should the law decisively intervene in that conduct? Help us get to 200,000 subscribers. If you're listening on a podcast platform, give us a positive rating on YouTube, like, share, subscribe, and thank you for joining us for yet another installment of SMWX. I look forward to your comments down below. I may not be right. Again, on this platform, it's not about imposing my view on you. It's giving you a perspective, helping you to more deeply analyze the question, and then you can make your mind up from there. Let's continue the conversation. Join us for the next installment. And have a good one. Aye.